very much, David. So the title of my talk, Innovation in Applied Neuroscience from Research to Products. The reason for this, I want to tell you a bit about what we're doing technically, but for us it's always been very important that the research that we do has a real impact. And one of the main ways you can have impact is to develop actual products that get out into the world. So for us, this has always been kind of at the core of what we do. So Starlab, to tell you a bit about it, it's a private research company, been around since 2000, with this idea of kind of taking science to technology to product. The main areas we have at the moment are neuroscience and space. So we have various applications we develop in these two areas. But today, I'm just going to talk about Neuro Electrics. So what is Neuro Electrics? Neuro Electrics is a spin-off we created about 3 years ago. And it's all about a new paradigm for monitoring and stimulating the brain, so in both directions, looking at what's happening in the brain, brain activity, but also modulating what's happening in the brain. To go back to the start, we actually started with a research question, as we always do, and at the time it was this idea, could computers someday interact directly with the human brain? So you're probably familiar with brain-computer interfaces. We wondered, could we have a computer-brain interface and kind of go the other direction? So this became a European research project about 8 years ago, under the Future Emerging Technologies program that you heard about earlier today. And we thought, okay, so we want to interact with the brain. What is the brain? We're physicists, so for us, the brain is an electrical system. So we work with the electric brain, and we thought, okay, how can we interact with this system? So on the one hand, EEG has been around for a very long time. Simply measuring voltages on the scalp, we can measure brain, the accumulation of all the brain activities, let's say. And by placing electrodes in different places, we can say something about where that activity is coming from on the cortex. So that's our read side of the scenario. On the other side, we looked at a lot of different technologies, but for reasons that will become clear later, we chose transcranial current stimulation, quite similar to EEG in the sense that it's electrical. We're putting small currents into the brain. And you can do it with very similar technologies. So you'll have seen in these last 2 slides a picture of the cap that David referenced earlier. So on the one hand, we have EEG to read activity. On the other hand, transcranial current stimulation to put information into the brain. So to tell you a little bit more about that as kind of background information, the mechanism. So we have an anode and a cathode, 2 electrodes on the brain somewhere on the scalp, so it's non-invasive. And what you're doing if you drive current in using the anode is you're basically hyperpolarizing the neurons, or at least the neurons that are orthogonal to the direction of the electric field. And this essentially increases excitability. It makes it more likely that those neurons will fire. And the cathode, you have the opposite. So we talk about stimulation, but you can actually do either stimulation or inhibition. So with the cathode, you're doing exactly the opposite. Currents are coming out of the cortex, out of the scalp, and you're actually making it less likely that neurons fire. Okay? So that's kind of the basic mechanism, or at least it's our working theory as to what the mechanism is for this. Okay, so with those 2 pieces, we basically built a platform. For the moment, it's a research platform. So on one hand, we have EEG for reading, basically linked to diagnostics. On the other side, electrical stimulation, mostly linked to therapies. In the middle, we have our cap, which was actually kind of modeled on Peter Cech's cap. So it's football rather than rugby. But it's basically this. This is the entire device. It's that easy to put on. It's Bluetooth, ready to go. This particular device is using dry electrodes right now, so I can only read brain activity. But if I was using different electrodes with this device as it is, in software I could choose if I was going to read or write to the brain for any given electrode and control, let's say, the intensity of the occurrence and the type of stimulation that I'm going to use, the protocol. So those 2 pieces come together. We have a cloud system, so we can remotely monitor what somebody's doing with the system, which allows us to think about doing things at home. So right now, I'm pretty sure it's the only cloud-controlled wearable wireless EEG and brain stimulation system that could potentially be taken home. So it's kind of a long, clumsy sentence I put together earlier on this morning. I think kind of covers all the key aspects of this technology. So that's the hardware. That's what we developed. So the key elements of this and why it's different, say, to a lot of other technologies that are out there, there are 2. One of them is multi-site. So we have 8 electrodes on this version. We go up to 32 by the end of this year. And if you look at these diagrams, on the top you have a traditional stimulation device using our modeling. We can kind of show you what happens when you stimulate. So you have two large sponges on the cortex. On the right-hand side, you can see a little red square on the cortex. That's your target. With a traditional system using large sponges, this is what happens when you stimulate. You can see a very diffuse stimulation all over the cortex. The red is the maximal stimulation. Down below, using multi-site stimulation, so we have a lot of electrodes. We can control the current in each one independently in software. We can build an electric field as we want. And we have algorithms to optimize the configuration. In other words, to tell you where to put the electrodes. And then in software, we configure each one independently to maximally stimulate the target. And this is the kind of result you can achieve with that. So you can see the little red square on the left, on the bottom, very closely matches the target. So that's one of the key aspects. The other key aspect is because we have all of this in a single cap, we can now think about closed loop. So in real time, we can measure brain activity, and we can update the parameters of the stimulation based on what's happening in the brain. So this is another very important aspect. Okay, so those are kind of the key aspects, the differentiators for our technology versus some of the other ones out there at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, we want this to have impact out in the world, so we've been working with a lot of, say, research partners over the last couple of years on different applications. And just kind of give you a flavor of the types of things people are doing with the device, I have kind of a few examples here. So this is an example from Barcelona, the Guttmann Institute. Hopefully this video will play. No? Could you click on that maybe? No? Okay. So this is a scenario where at the Guttmann Institute, they have patients, a lot of patients that come in for therapy for neuropathic pain, so spinal cord injury. What they do is they have a virtual system where they show a video of the person, so they're in a wheelchair. They can see virtual legs moving with the top half of their body as their real body, okay? So they're looking at an image of themselves walking. At the same time, they're stimulating their motor cortex. And this gives them pain relief for several days. So they come in for a 20-minute session, half-hour session of this therapy, and they get days of relief from their neuropathic pain. They're treating like 5 patients a day with this. It's still preclinical, so there's been no clinical trials on this, but patients are very happy with the results. Private clinics, doctors can use it if they want, even though it hasn't been technically approved for this, but very happy with the results. This one is an example from Tübingen, again a video which I guess won't play, no. Here we have an exoskeleton controlled by motor imagery from the BCI. So this guy can't open or close his hand. He's wearing an exoskeleton that controls that. He's imagining moving his right hand or his left hand to open and close the exoskeleton, which is opening and closing for him. So this is an example of BCI. Completely wireless, although the robotic exoskeleton isn't just yet. This is an example outside of the kind of same directly medical but related to wellness. So this is a group from Burke Rehabilitation Center and Red Bull. They did some research with elite athletes to see if they could modulate basically their ability to break through their own physical barriers by stimulating the brain at key points. So it's about overcoming physical barriers by stimulating the cortex. This is an example from Spalding in Boston. So on the left you have post-stroke rehabilitation. This is a guy who gets physical therapy a couple of days a week, but while he's doing it, he's getting his motor cortex stimulated. This accelerates the process of physical rehab. And they're shaving off up to 3 months of what they typically see in how long it takes to rehabilitate patients. Again, preclinical. You would have to do a very large study to kind of demonstrate the efficacy as a treatment. But they're seeing very interesting kind of preclinical results. On the right, it's a 3-year-old boy who almost drowned, traumatic brain injury following the almost drowning. Wasn't responding to any therapy. They'd given up hope, basically. And they decided to try what for them was a new technique, so brain stimulation. And within a month, this little boy was responding to his mother's voice, had regained motor control, was able to solve simple puzzles. And they'd given up. Like they had nothing else to try at this hospital. Another case study, a single case. So we'll see what happens. But very, very encouraging, say, early results with this technology. We're working very closely with Adam Ghazali's group at UCSF, and he developed, and there was a lot of noise about it in Nature a couple of years ago, a very simple game, cognitive training to improve multitasking. And he got very, very strong results. He took a group of over 65s to the limit, to say the level of 20-year-olds in terms of their ability to multitask, using just a very simple tablet-based game. We're now looking at stimulating while playing the game with real-time feedback based on activity, using neural correlates that we know are linked to the cognitive performance. So the game updates based on your brain activity as well as your score in the game. And then we're going to add the third part of stimulating while you're playing to kind of enhance this effect. And all of this is going to be done at home. So we're going to kind of take all this technology out of the lab and send it home. Another example at Oxford. This is from Roy Cohen-Kadosh's group at Oxford. He published some very interesting work on cognitive enhancement. So he's using our device for people with dyscalculia. So they have, which is like the numerical version of dyslexia. So they have problems with some mathematical tasks. And they were able to demonstrate improved mathematical ability following a couple of sessions of stimulation while training on very specific mathematical tasks. So again, very, very interesting research there. Okay, so I mentioned going home and kind of the importance of the wearability of the device and how easy it is to use out of the lab. This has always been kind of at the core of it. One of the reasons is that this type of stimulation has to be repeated. You need multiple sessions over many days to see an effect, and this is obviously much easier to do at home. So we did a test in Barcelona on a migraine study where they took it home for a couple of weeks. We remotely controlled what they were able to do with the device. We were also able to monitor compliance remotely. So we think there's a lot of possibilities in that area where we give a simplified version of this cap to the patient to take home. Very robust, that they can't really move electrodes. It'll only work for them. It'll only work for as long as it should each day, so they can't overstimulate. We think about this in terms of dosage, similar to any medication. So the amount of current inject into the brain is the dose. So we try to control this. If you're wondering how a single device can be used for so many applications, it's because every specific configuration of the electrode positions and the current intensities and what you're doing while you stimulate changes the intervention completely. So every single one of those is a different intervention, even though it's all with the same platform. So I mentioned innovation and getting it out into the world. Our model so far is we work with partners. We've sold this in over 40 countries as a research platform. So we have all these teams out there at some of the top institutes and hospitals around the world trying to figure out what can be done with this device for us. Okay? Meanwhile, we've realized that the dynamic and individual nature of brain disease requires a new approach. We have to get these devices out there, bring them home, have these kind of closed loop systems where the intervention depends on your ongoing brain activity. So there's not one size fits all at all. We need the closed loop for this to work properly. Okay, so to go back to where I started with this research question, can we interact with the brain? Last August, we published a paper in PLOS ONE where we demonstrated for the first time direct brain-to-brain communication. So on the one hand, we had this device recording brain activity. We had one of our researchers was imagining moving his left hand or his right hand. This was like a 0 or a 1 that we were transmitting. In this case, we transmitted that signal from, he was in India at the time, so he transmitted it to another group in France where we had a stimulation device. In this case, TMS, which is magnetic stimulation, much more spatially precise and a much stronger effect, and we needed that for this particular experiment. But we were stimulating the visual cortex, so people were seeing virtual flashes of light or not, and this was like receiving the 0s or 1s. So the key point here is that the guy who was imagining moving his hands wasn't using any of his peripheral nervous system, just his brain. And the receiver wasn't receiving any information through his peripheral nervous system. He was perceiving virtual light by direct stimulation of his visual cortex. Optical nerve wasn't involved. So it was direct brain to brain. None of their external nervous system was involved. It was kind of trivial in a sense, almost gimmicky, as in all of this existed for a long time, but by kind of putting it together, we for the very first time had brain-to-brain communication, which is what we started out trying to do like 8 years ago. We got a lot of press attention, and people kept talking about telepathy, and we kept saying this isn't telepathy, or anything close to telepathy, but they kept saying it and saying it and saying it. So eventually we said, okay, telepathy if you like, and that became the headline everywhere. We try to say tech-lepathy now whenever they ask. So that's kind of the full circle of how you take research to products and kind of what happens along the way and some of the technologies you can develop. And that's all. Thank you very much.